So for those of you who are just tuning in, I am reading my dad's manuscripts, and good gravy. I don't remember how many I've done so far. I've done a bunch of them, about 3 or 4, I think. Anyway, you can go back and call me on it. Anyway, this one is a little bit different from the other ones. This one is, well, it started off in a modern time setting, but like many 80s shows, many 80s fantasies, they got transported to another world. We don't really know much beyond that at the moment, so we'll see where it goes from there. Last night was chapter 1, and tonight is chapter 2 of Plague Wizards, and we'll see how it goes from there. So, without further ado, here is Plague Wizards chapter 2. Royan Gredian's child woke up to hear a voice. "He's waking up," someone else said. "Maker be thanked." Royan wondered at that. Why should it be such a wonder that he was waking up? He tried to reply, but was suddenly drifting off into the dreams of vividly colored plants and trees. When he woke again, it was full daylight. One of the household servants was leaning over him. After a moment, his hazy mind recognized Valian, chief servant of the household. But Valian's job was overseeing the other servants. What was he doing by Royan's bedside, like an ordinary menial? "Are you awake, Royan, sir?" "Yes, I am. I believe I am awake. Is something wrong?" "There's trouble in the house, Royan, sir. Big trouble. Everyone's dead, save for the ones who are still sleeping. The house is in ruins. Most of the masters are dead. The rest are all still sleeping. The king himself has been asking in regard to this." Royan's mind, still hazy, refused to comprehend all this. He held up a hand. "Wait, the house is in ruins, you say? What caused it? An earthquake?" "No, Royan, sir. Not the house, not the building, but all the masters. Nobody knows what happened. But the suspicion is that a spell went awry and caused the deaths of many who are most capable of magic. So far as anyone knows, all the most learned in the city are dead. The less learned, those not as learned as the chief masters, were put into a sleep from which they can't be wakened. You're the most learned to recover." "Surely not the only one." "Well, Royan, sir, it is said that Olabaj, sir, and Naram, sir, have awoken, but their minds are affected." "The Grand Master?" "Dead, Royan, sir. You're the only one left to give instructions." The servant said this as if it relieved him from an intolerable burden. Royan attempted to sit up and fell back. He attempted again, and the servant sprang to help him. It occurred to Royan that Valian was dreadfully afraid of having to give orders that were the prerogative of the master. Royan, whose status in the household was that of an adopted son of a nephew of the Grand Master, knew the chief servant mostly by reputation. He had little to do with Valian in the general course of things. In theory, any family member could give orders to Valian, but Valian's main function was seeing to the smooth running of the household. Royan shook his head again. "All right, Valian, I'm awake for now, and I'll do what needs to be done. First, have someone bring me a bowl of broth and a loaf of bread. I don't know how long I've been asleep, but I feel weak. Prepare lists and reports for me as to what has happened, and I'll deal with the matters as soon as I am able." "Yes, Royan, sir." As Valian hurried out, Royan realized that Valian would be able to do a fair job of running the household, in so far as its daily functions were concerned. What he lacked was someone at the top, in whose name he could give orders. He did the best he could, but even the bowl of soup and broth didn't restore him altogether. One moment he was reading lists, the next minute he was waking up in his bed again. He recognized the servant bending over him this time, a young man named Dave Alma. You are awake, Ryan, sir? There was concern in the young man's voice and features. I'm awake. It took Ryan a moment to recall the situation he'd learned it previously. Yes, I'm awake. How long was I asleep this time? Only over the night, Ryan, sir. But a royal messenger has come 3 times to inquire if anyone in the household can shed light on the strange happenings. Is it an attack from Saljashan? And if so, how do we counter it? The royal messenger desires any information we can give. I see. At present, I know nothing. No, don't tell the messenger that. Tell him we're working on the problem. Just as the servant was about to leave, Royan called him back. A moment. The Grand Master is dead? Yes, Royan, sir. The circumstances? He was in the middle of a working when he was struck down. No one knows what the working was, only that it required the sacrifice of a large Deja. Royan's eyes went wide. The Deja was a large hornless animal with three-toed hooves used for milk, meat, and hide. The Deja was a large hornless animal with three-toed hooves used for milk, meat, and hide. A working involved the Deja was a powerful one. Cold shivered down his spine. A large Deja? And he died in the working? Yes, so it seems, Ryan, sir. And the shield spells didn't contain the power? I don't know, Ryan, sir. Of course he didn't know. He's a servant, not a magician, and he wouldn't know the working from a wardrobe. No wizardly household would make a servant of someone in the least amount of magical capability. I'll have to look at his workroom. Get me a cup of Rizal infusion. Yes, Ryan, sir. Rizal infusion, the stalks of the Rizal plant, soaked in wine over a low fire, was a concoction used to keep magicians awake and alert during long workings, and more clandestinely, to keep students awake for the long study sessions. Royan knew that it wasn't safe for him to be taking it in his condition, but he also knew that his alternatives were limited. If something had killed the master of the household and all those others, and disabled so many others, it was necessary to find out just what it had been. The Rizal was, as usual, not very palatable going down. Also, as usual, it took only moments for it to begin having its effect. First, his eyes began to see patterns they had never noticed before. The grain in the wood paneling of the room, the precise makeup of the diagonal lines in the piece of a tapestry. He pulled his mind from these. Let's go to the Grand Master's workroom. Yes, Royan, sir. The servant hovered as Royan moved, slowly, toward the door. As Royan kept his feet moving, one after the other, he realized that he was in a bad way. Without the Rizal, he likely would have fallen flat on his face. He made his way to the Grand Master's suite, restraining himself several times from shouting at Dave Alma to stop fussing at him. He managed this mostly by remembering that he was the highest master presently in the command of his faculties, making his welfare of utmost importance to the servants. There was a whiff of blood and corruption at the door of the room, but otherwise the room was clean. The bodies? Your pardon, sir. The animal was burned, and the Grand Master was buried. They were beginning to, smell? Yes, of course. A Deja, eh? The last was spoken only to himself, but the servant answered it anyway. Yes, Royan, sir. A large one. I see. Royan looked around the workroom. One of those jars over there will have grain in it. Bring one grain over to the lamp. Yes, Royan, sir. The man went quickly to the jars and found grain in the second one. Royan wondered why the jars were not labeled, but the answer came to him immediately. The Grandmaster would pride himself on knowing where everything was in his workshop, and his conceit forbade him from resorting to labels. De Valma came back with a handful of grain, and Royan, with difficulty, held himself back from saying, "Only 1 grain, fool!" But instead, he picked out 1 grain and said, "Put the rest back, please." It probably wasn't a good idea to try working in his state, Rizzle or not, but this was a very tiny one. He spoke a bidding formula, and tossed the grain into the flame of the lamp. It blazed for an instant and was gone. Without any spectacular flashes or flares, a set of dotted green lines showed along all the edges of the room, on the floor and ceiling, as well as all the corners. He counted the number of dots from the floor to the top of the molding around the door, and then made calculations. The Rizzle permitted him to finish the calculations long before the lines died out. 3 months! It's been 3 months since shields were raised in this room. Yes, Royan, sir. But I was told this disaster happened when? 2 weeks ago, Royan, sir. Then the Grandmaster was doing a working involving the sacrifice of Adasia without first establishing shields? Ridiculous! Yes, Royan, sir. Royan looked at the servant. Sorry. Not something you'd know about, of course. No, Royan, sir. Where are his notes? Foolish question. They're over on the table. Yes, they were on the table. In a jumble, too. It seemed likely they had been scattered in the course of the disaster, and the servants, unable to make head nor tail of them, had simply stacked them. Royan cast an eye over them. Grandmaster Tangrel was very well known for his distrustful nature, among other things. It came, Royan thought, mostly from continuous rivalry to be the next Grandmaster. The choice was made on the basis of who was the most powerful wizard. This meant that every aspiring wizard got into the habit of keeping his experiments carefully hidden from other wizards until he had perfected them, and could demonstrate them for others, and have the keeper scribe them in the books. After one had become Grandmaster, he could not be removed until death, or the conclusive proof of certain crimes. But the life habits of secrecy were not easy to break. Thus, the greater part of Tangrel's notes were in code of some kind. He looked at De Valma. No notion of what he was working on? No, Royan, sir. His eyes fixed on the servant's face, and he had to pull his mind away from considering the pattern of wrinkles found there. What does gossip among servants say? And if you claim not to know, I'll have you dismissed as too stupid to serve in this household. He was immediately ashamed of his bullying tactics, as he saw the terror showing on De Valma's face. It said he was working at the Ascension gift, Royan, sir. Royan nodded. According to custom, every year on the anniversary of the king's ascension to the throne, the head of Pengwa household, as chief to the wizard to the king, would present the king a gift produced by the master's magic. What that gift might be depended very much on the mood of the king. Some previous kings preferred something useful, such as better grain, an improved Asia, or the like. King Tandwil preferred something frivolous and flashy, something that said his power was so great he could have the most powerful wizards waste their time making something for him. Thank you, De Valma. Would you please see to having the lists of the wizards, of whatever skill, still capable of functioning, delivered to my quarters? Yes, Royan, sir. The man was looking mystified at the sudden change of topic. Royan had begun to realize that, Rizzle infusion or no, he was not going to be able to handle all the problems that would need to be dealt with. Or perhaps the Rizzle infusion made him realize the fact that he was going to have to pass on some responsibility, keeping for himself the question of just what the Grandmaster had done to cause this. Royan looked around the table. There were only 3 of them, enough to share the load somewhat, but not as many as he would have liked. At this point, though, They didn't want any youngsters messing around with things. A 16-year-old might have a good deal of magical ability, but he or she didn't have the life experience to deal with political things. Orment Lipion's child was the next eldest after Royan, and capable enough to dislike taking Royan's orders. He was large and bulky with wild hair. His fingers were thick, but much more agile than they looked. Farrell Pindorona's child was the youngest, very slim and pale-looking, unsure of himself and trying not to show it. Royan looked down at the gleaming dark surface of the table, on which there were 3 piles of paper. I divided things up into 3 sections, one for each of us. Most of my time is going to be taken up with finding out just what happened to Grandmaster Tangrel. Further to that, I need to know any hints, even gossip, about what he was going to do. Ormond? Ormond shook his shaggy head. Nothing. Farrell? Well, I didn't feel it right to pry into the Grandmaster's business. He drummed his fingers on the table, and then jerked his hand into his lap. Royan gave him a stern look, still feeling a fraud in the Grandmaster's position. All right, what have you heard? No matter how ridiculous it might sound, this is for King Cardwell's ascension gift, remember? I heard it was said he was looking up all the works on the outside worlds. Some people said he was planning on taking the king on a tour of one of the worlds. Impossible, of course. Nobody could gather that much power, let alone work it. Royan grinned. Thank you. It's not likely, but it may lead to some other hint. Thanks. He paused. All right, then. Each of you, take your stack and read it over. See what you can get started at immediately. Then we'll have a meeting tomorrow again to discuss any difficulties. Any questions? Yes. Well, what puts you in charge? Royan nodded. It was a question he expected Ormond would ask. Seniority. The way we always pick Grandmaster. Grandmaster? Ormond's hands pressed on the tabletop. You're calling yourself a Grandmaster? We have to have a Grandmaster to speak to the king and to the other households. I'm the senior master left of any capability, which makes the job mine. He stopped before adding, as much as I don't want it. Some little bit of sense told him he daren't admit any weakness or indecision to Ormond. You really think you can manage the household? He gave Ormond a firm look. I know that I'm senior in years and ability, and that I've been working at this mess already. We've got to get ourselves sorted out, then we can argue about who's best for the job. At present, we've got the king demanding to know what's happened, we've got a disaster that's hit all the wizard households in the city, and that's a much bigger problem than whose butt warms which chair. Or do you really want some kind of election in these circumstances, Ormond, with the 3 voting members? Ormond shook his head, looking down at the paper stacks stacked before him. Royan put his hands on the table. If there's nothing else, I declare this meeting adjourned. Pagolini C. Fantana, watcher for the kingdom of Seljashan, looked out the window at the battered grey stone plinth, then frowned down at the report in his hand. It had been sent and received through fire, a magical means. No, he didn't like using magic, for all that it was necessary in some instances to see what life-twisters in Rosthan were up to. Disaster had, apparently, stricken the life-twisters. All of their most powerful grandmasters were dead or incapacitated, or at least those masters who lived in the king city of Gagapang. That was a stroke of fortune. He tapped a finger on the table before him. How badly were they weakened? Might it be possible to use this opportunity? He looked out the window, at the battered, statueless plinth, the piece of stone left there as a reminder to everyone. Once, long ago, a statue of the Blue Blossom Wizard had stood there. a wizard born and bred in the very city of Lunch Macor. The man had carefully built up over the years various knowledge of various herbal concoctions, as well as an army of men and terrible animals. With these he had taken over the kingdom of Seljashan. For many years the Blue Blossom Wizard had ruled, with increasing harshness, until the man of the harmonious hand had come, one who was immune to the narcotics the wizard had used to prevent uprising among his subjects. Over a space of several years, the man of harmonious hand organized a covert resistance to the wizard, and had at last overthrown him. They dragged down all the wizard statues, leaving this one plinth, with no statue in the center, of Lunch Macor, as a reminder. On feast days, people would come and throw the rocks at it. They had to maintain constant vigilance to prevent such a person as the Blue Blossom Wizard from arising again. The difficulty was, the kingdom of Rosthan stood next door to them. Rosthan which not only permitted magic, but gloried in it. Rosthan, where wizards boasted of their abilities to cause plants to change into what they desired, to produce this or that new effect, even new medicines. The rulers of Seljashan had always known that something must be done about Rosthan. But the difficulty was to decide just how to go about it. It was known that Seljashani were slipping over there to be trained. Some even attempted to slip back after having trained. Any one of them might be another Blue Blossom Wizard. So far as it could be determined, none of these had survived. But that battered plinth still stood as a warning. Hedjalani rapped on the workroom door, then opened it without waiting for a response from inside. A chubby little balding man looked up as Hedjalani entered, and then looked back to his work. Figures and computations scribbled in charcoal on a large square plank of wood. Hedjalani, irritated at the man who would so casually ignore him, said, "How is the work, Melunktal?" Melunktal C. Talrun looked up again. "A few little wrinkles to smooth out, Hajdi, my boy, but I wouldn't want to turn these things loose too soon. Could turn around and bite back at us." "How long?" "How high is up? How far is away? You have at least a bit of understanding of what we do, Hajdi. It's a matter of slow, careful steps, sometimes finding an answer that puts us way ahead, sometimes finding a problem that keeps us at stop for months. Saying when we will have it ready to put into action? That's something only a fool would attempt." "Not the answer I need, Melunktal. I've just received word that there's been a catastrophe among the Life Twisters. Most of their wizards are dead or incapacitated. This would be an ideal time to strike, and they wouldn't be able to deal with it." "Can't do it, Haji. There's still one possibility in 100 that these things we're working at will take a wild change, and that would mean the plagues coming back at us, and us as defenseless against them as the Roshanites." 1 in 100? I'd say that's fairly safe. Melunktal gave him one of those "you don't know what you're talking about" looks. "Don't think of it as the 100th one is the bad one. Think of it more like having a handful of 100 grains. One of them is deadly poison. You start eating them one by one. Is it the first one, or the second, or the 76th? Still an extremely simplistic analogy, but more representative of the danger. I'll be sure to tell you when it's safe to use." He turned back to his calculations. Hedjalani knew that trying to continue the discussion was futile. Jaws firmly clenched, he left the room. Royan had to do a good deal of digging, but the situation grew clearer. The notes didn't say exactly why, but Tangrel had apparently been working out at touching one of the outside worlds. Not all scholars agreed on the existence of the outside worlds, and Royan himself had just recently been able to accept the theory. The theory was that there were other worlds beside this one. Worlds with strange people and animals. Worlds with walking trees and enormous flying beasts. Even touching one of the other worlds took a lot of power, though. Observing would be terribly difficult, and for all that might be learned, the power could be better used in other ways. Moving between worlds, no, that wasn't something to even think of. Unless, of course, you were Tangrel, with an intense belief in your own ability. Among the papers was a chart of planetary conjunctions, a chart which had no relation to bodies in the sky above Gagapang. Tangrel had, it seemed, dragged something out of that other world, a living being, apparently. A calculation of the power required, even with the planets, both here and there, in favorable conjunction, suggested that Tangrel had done away with everything not directly necessary to the task. That had included the shields. Of course, Grandmaster Tangrel did not need shields. Nothing could go wrong with one of his workings. Except that it had. When one was doing a working involving a sacrifice of a large Deja, the strain would be severe. Apparently it had been too much, even for the highly superior Grandmaster Tangrel. With no shields, when Tangrel collapsed, a large amount of magic had gone wild, striking hard at every magically competent person in a wild circle around the household. Burn it to powder! All this and for what? Bringing someone over from an outside? Why bother? The only clue seemed to be in Tangrel's nose. A question. What sort of plants might be over there? If that had been the question, why bring a person over? He might have to do some tracing to see if someone had indeed been brought over, and possibly destroyed in the blast of power? No, the blast of power would only have killed him, or her, or it. Whatever the gender, there should be a corpse. Yes, he was going to have to do that. The king's messenger, a small man in a beaded jacket, displayed obvious impatience. Certainly other wizardly households have declared that a reprehensible act has been committed, which centered around the Pangua household. It is suggested this is a hostile action aimed directly at them. Royan kept an expressionless face. To admit any fault ran the risk of having the Pangua household broken up, and its people and possessions distributed among its rivals. At the end of it all, he might well be the last master of Pangua household, but he would do all he could to prevent that. The Pangua household had been badly affected by this disaster, probably no less so than any other. No one ought to say that it was a deliberate act on our part. Only that Tangrel didn't intend the disaster, but we won't talk about that. So you say. Royan calmly raised his eyebrows. Does not the fact that it is I, rather than some senior master, sitting here meeting with you, suggesting something? Suppose the king requires an inspection of your household to ascertain that it is as you say. Has the king made such a request? No, not yet. Royan spread his hands. I will not make decisions based on a hypothetical possibility. When the king makes such a request, I will make a response at that time. The king's messenger was clearly annoyed. He had tried to bluff on Royan that he would never have thought of trying on one of the senior masters who were now dead or incapacitated. Royan himself was trying hard not to show any sign of the lack of assurance that haunted him. The messenger nodded. I will take your word to the king. Royan stared deep into the dark glossy finish of the council table, then raised his eyes. He mustn't seem to be burdened with matters, for the sake of Farrell's morale. Or as for Ormond, they needn't any rebellion in the household council, truncated as it was. I've put the king off temporarily, but we can expect a demand for inspection in 3 days to a couple of weeks. At that point, I may be able to put the matter off for another few days by appealing the decision, but we should be ready for the worst. We have to have our household and condition to be seen by that time, including hospice wards. He paused. Farrell, our financial status? Farrell flinched as though he'd been accused of something. We might be said to be on a sound footing, financially. Over the decades, we've gathered a good deal of wealth and held on to a considerable sum of it. We could possibly survive for another 5 years without any further income. A good deal of money has been invested in loans to merchants and caravan traders, such that we will have to continue to have some small income. I've also worked out the costs of maintaining the incapacitated seniors that will continue to be a burden to us in the future. I would suggest accelerated training from some of our junior people so that they might be able to augment the household income. What about standing contracts? Are there still any we can fulfill with our present resources? How many will have to be cancelled, and what is our liability for the cancellation? Farrell's eyes went wide. Clearly he had missed something. Young fool! You've... Ormant flared. Ormant? Royan's voice overrode Ormant's. We're all having to do things we've never had the least training for. We'll get nowhere if we shout at each other for failings. Farrell, you best look into the matter. Find out which contracts can be delayed without penalty, which ones cancelled without serious loss. Bring us a current report at the next meeting. Ormant, do you have anyone capable of teaching, and do we have anyone capable of being taught? Ormant drew a breath. Not as many as we'd want. We have a couple hundred youngsters who can put together simple spells, but I'd hate to see any of them turned loose on a major working. We don't have any teachers left. We have some of those who are assistants, but that meant mostly that they saw to it that all the equipment and supplies were set out for demonstrations and put back in stores afterwards. I'd hate to see any of them turned loose as teachers. Royan nodded briefly. I accept your concerns. However, if Pangua household is to continue, we're going to have to bring our youngsters along, and bring them faster than usual. Pick the students you think best able to profit by, and have them given advanced lessons, as far advanced as seems safe to you, consistent with the need to have more masters. Masters? Try to make masters, and it will ruin the household for sure. That's why you'll be overseeing the matter personally. Are you able to do so? I? Able? Ormant stopped a moment. I suppose I'll have to be, won't I? He looked up, frowning. Why did Tangrel take such a risk anyway? As I understand it, he was working at providing something spectacular for Ascension Day. In order to do so, he needed the power that should have gone into the shields. His body couldn't take the strain of that much magical power, so he died in the midst of the spell, with the results we're all so aware of. What on earth was he doing? I've only been able to find out some general things. The rest I'm still working out. Why should it take out all the more powerful masters first? Farrell asked. Missed that part of training, eh? Ormant eyed Farrell with annoyance. You know the way to build our power up is to use it. Press against the boundaries, so to speak. Something like exercising muscles. But the increase in power comes along with increased susceptibility to wild magic. Take note of that fact. Royan frowned. All right, Ormond. No use running the thing into the ground. He's right, though, Farrell. We've survived because we weren't quite so susceptible to the wild magic let loose by Tangrel's death. Nor is it quite so simple as Ormond suggests. There are a few masters who have survived, less powerful than we, but whose minds are still badly affected. There are even some students who've had a moment of unconsciousness, and are well, save for having lost part of their memory. The whole subject is something that needs to be studied, but not at the moment. Not until we have the household back on sound footing again. Ormond leaned forward. All these people still unconscious. We know for a fact that they'll be no use to us, even if they wake. Might it not be best for the household if we quietly do away with all of them? Our resources are not totally unlimited. The difficulty with quashing the notion immediately, Royan realized, was that it was something that had occurred to him too. Still, he shook his head. No, I don't say absolutely not. There may come a time when keeping such people is no mercy to them. But I won't murder people simply to avoid the expense of caring for them. Ormond merely nodded. Royan had a suspicion that he'd just been testing to see how far Royan could be pushed. After the meeting, he went back to his investigation of Tangrel's working. Some things were not altogether clear, but some things could be determined. For instance, using the conjunction of planets proper for such a working, he had sent a seedling tree over to this other world. That one had required power, but not so much as that he had no left over for shields. There were certain spells on this seedling which would attract a person of a certain sort. These spells were derived from other spells, so that their general nature was not hard to determine. The specific sort of person they were meant to attract was quite another matter, but he left that aside for a time. So the old master had taken a living person willy-nilly from their own world as an ascension gift? It fit with his high-handed personality, but something was missing. How does one prove to an unwizardly king that this person before them was indeed from another world? It allowed too much scope for the other households to start rumors of fraud. Proving or disproving that fraud depended on the word of wizards, any of whom had other ties to Pangua or rivalries with them. However, magic did not appear to work reliably on the other world, so it had apparently taken some time to attract the proper person. Why had Tangrel required a woman specifically? Had it been merely the fact that a woman is likely to be smaller, hence less difficult to bring over? The effect of the conjunction of planets would last 2, perhaps 3 days, which meant that whoever Tangrel was bringing, it would have to be done within that time frame. The trap, for which he could no longer think of it any other way, had been sprung at mere last possible moment, just as the conjunction was passing. Then, was likely the reason for the overstrain that had killed Tangrel. He looked up. How necessary was all this? Or were there things more immediately necessary to the survival of the household? There was probably going to come a time when he would have to set forth the results of his investigation, at least to the king. How deep, though, did he need to go? Well, there was at least one thing remaining. There had been no strange people found in the Grand Master's workroom. The servants would have let him know. The spell, therefore, didn't seem to have worked. On the other hand, there were 2 phases involved in the spell: bringing the person into this world, and bringing her to the Master's presence. If the first part had succeeded but not the second, the person might be anywhere in the world. Likely dead, of course. But still, Royan felt he should look. Seeing if someone was presently in this world who belonged in another world was mostly a matter of knowing what to ask. He took the little knife from his waist and pricked his thumb. Dropping 2 drops of blood onto a piece of paper, he tossed the paper into the fire. A picture formed in the flames, a picture of a woman dressed in the fashion of Gagapang, though the fashion was about 5 years back. She was seated in a rough wooden cabin, to all appearances in good health. At a guess, she was in one of the farming villages in the hinterlands. He wondered if Tangrel had tried to mix some good luck charms into his spells, just in case. Not only had she come on farmers quite soon, but farmers who didn't just kill her as an outsider and appropriate her clothing. Something ought to be done for her. It really wasn't fair, jerking her out of her home and leaving her in a farming village in the middle of nowhere. He cancelled the fire seeing. No, it wasn't fair that Tangrel's overweening conceit and self-confidence should destroy the Pangua household, let alone all the wizardly households in Gegapeng. There were more important things that needed to be done right now, and many people besides one dark-haired woman depended on his decisions. But the rare, raven-haired outside woman strayed into his thoughts from time to time. Yes, we are willing to allow the king's men to come and see the status of our household. We are not willing, though, to allow the members of other wizardly households to inspect us, gleaning whatever they may of our secrets. If, however, the king is willing to issue a command that our representative be allowed to inspect their households, with royal troops accompanying us, we will consider the matter. The men wearing robes of masters in various households stood still, clearly at a loss as to what to say. Royan was fairly sure that all of them, with the possible exception of the representative of Pantatiqua, the Pantatiqua household, were dressed up students, nowhere near capable of dealing with political matters at this level, and likely afraid to speak for fear of fouling things up. The fellow from Pantatiqua, though, was less willing to hold his silence. Is it not a fact that, rather than fear of our discerning their so-called magical secrets, the masters of Pangua are far more concerned about one secret, that rather than mere focus of disaster, this was attack on all our households? It was a predictable line of attack. The representative of Pantatiqua House has proof of this assertion, of course. It is clear that the magic that caused the ruin was centered around Pangua House. I see. And by whose evidence? By evidence of all the households represented here, none of whom have any reason to make trouble for Pangua House? Got you. The representative of Pantatiqua household glowered. Everyone knew that the disaster had centered around Pangua House. Everyone present also knew their status as competitors to Pangua House made their witness suspect in unbiased eyes. And where could any serious witness be found who were neither beholden to Pangua or one of the other rivals? It was likely that the next visit by the king's soldiers would be accompanied by an order to allow the inspection, without conditions, on pain of royal displeasure. The longer this was delayed, though, the better Royan would be able to shore up matters in the household. The royal messenger looked as if he'd swallowed something ill-tasting and indigestible. I will take your words to the king. I do not think he will be pleased. Very well. Royan knew that the mention of the king's displeasure was intended to push him into backing down, but he did not comply. If he buckled under such a nebulous threat, the carrion eaters would descend to pick Pengua's bones. Okay, so that was chapter 2, and I'm gonna say this chapter is much better than the previous chapter. Yeah, I am interested to continue on. Pardon me. So I will talk to you all again really soon, and I will see you tomorrow. Have a good night, everybody.